Chinese suppliers are going viral on TikTok, exposing everyone's favorite luxury brands as being produced in China at just a fraction of the cost. We'll discuss this latest front in the tariff war and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace, where every week we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate but know so little about. I'm Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. The Trump administration has revoked a Chinese student's visa just 3 weeks before his graduation. Jason Ma, who is set to graduate from Carnegie Mellon with an engineering degree in December, has lived in the U.S. since 2016. He received a phone call from a school official notifying him of the revocation, but has not received any explanation as to why. Despite this, Carnegie Mellon is allowing him to continue attending classes. Ma is determined to finish his degree and reunite with his mother in China, who is battling cancer. Ma's case is part of a concerning trend. According to Inside Higher Education, as of April 16th, at least 1,300 overseas students and recent graduates at more than 200 U.S. institutions had seen their visas revoked or legal status terminated in recent weeks. Most of the international students who recently lost their visas come from China, with many others coming from Iran or India. The world's first humanoid robot half-marathon race kicked off in China on Saturday. The race was held at Beijing's Economic Technological Development Area, where 20 robots joined 12,000 humans to challenge themselves on a 21-kilometer course. The marathon, hosted in China's tech hub, was a live demonstration of the country's progress in humanoid robotics. China hopes the development of these robots could lead the way in revolutionizing healthcare, manufacturing, disaster response, and even elderly care. Teams from universities and companies showed off all different kinds of bipedal robots, with the fastest, Tiangong Ultra, clocking in at 2 hours and 40 minutes, just over an hour behind the human winner. Chinese surgeons have successfully implanted the world's smallest and lightest artificial heart into a 7-year-old boy. The patient, who is suffering from end-stage heart failure, has become the youngest person in the world to receive a magnetically levitated biventricle assist device, or an artificial heart. The surgery, performed earlier this month at Wuhan Union Hospital in central China, represents a significant breakthrough that could revolutionize pediatric cardiac care worldwide. The 7-year-old was diagnosed with dilated cardiomyopathy in May of 2024, and later experienced severe cardiogenic shock. Due to challenges in finding a compatible donor heart with the boy's blood type, doctors opted for an artificial heart instead. A team of doctors carried out the 5-hour surgery, and by the next day, the boy was breathing on his own. His heart function has been steadily improving since, according to the medical team. Well, yesterday kicked off the Balikatan joint military exercises in the Philippines. Over 14,000 soldiers, mostly from the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific Command, will be participating in the annual war games. As part of these war drills, the U.S. will deploy ship-sinking missiles to the Luzon Strait, a choke point for Chinese naval access to the Pacific Ocean. The Navy Marine Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, also known as the Nemesis, is being deployed to a strategic first island chain choke point in the waters between Taiwan and the Philippines, U.S.-based Naval News reported. The Nemesis is a ground-based anti-ship missile launcher, which has the capability of striking ships from a distance of over 100 nautical miles. The Philippines forms part of the first island chain under a U.S. maritime containment strategy seeking to restrict China's access to the wider Western Pacific Ocean using U.S.-aligned territories such as Taiwan and Japan. The Luzon Strait between southern Taiwan and the northern Philippines links the South China Sea to the Philippine Sea, a gateway for China's Navy beyond the first island chain. Balikatan this year runs from April 21st to May 9th. Well, Chinese manufacturers have hit back at Trump's tariff war. Viral videos on social media the last couple of weeks have exposed European and American name brands as being produced in China at just a tiny fraction of the cost of what you're paying. What does this all say about China's place in the global supply chain? To discuss this, we are happy to have on Eugene Pereier. Eugene is a journalist, writer, and co-host of The Freedom Side on Breakthrough News. Eugene, welcome back to the show.
Amanda, thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you back, and I'm sure you've seen all the viral videos at this point. I have seen some of them say that at least 80% of all luxury brands are produced in China. And I've been following this conversation mostly on Xiaohongshu. And, there's the American people's shock at this revelation. But then in the comments, I'll see a lot of Chinese people being like, everyone has known this for years. Only the Americans are realizing this now. And it just goes to show you how good their propaganda is. And then they start naming off all of the different factories in Guangzhou. This factory produces for Prada. This factory makes things for Gucci, for Chanel. So, I'm curious to know, what you think about all of this. If so many of these name brands are actually produced in China, to what extent are the exorbitant prices that we're paying for them just a matter of branding and nothing more?
I think it's almost exclusively branding. And that's the thing about sort of globalized production. I think most people had some sense that, the reason why they're making things in China, Vietnam, India is that the wages are lower, but people don't know the specifics. And I think that was one of the things I think about a lot of these videos that was very evocative. I remember there was one particularly about designer bags that was like, this is the thread they use. This is the leather they use. This is how much it costs. And so I think that's why it's evoked such a widespread, revulsion in the United States, because you're thinking, okay, I know I'm being like ripped off, but how much am I being ripped off? And I think people might think, oh, maybe it's $1 here, $2 there. But when you're starting to learn, it could be thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars, or at least, huge markups, 100%. I mean, you even think about basic things like PVH is a good example of this. It's a huge clothing company. They own Calvin Klein. Now, if you go online and you search Calvin Klein t-shirts, you can find a lot of those, designer Calvin Klein t-shirts, just a regular t-shirt, but you're paying $36 for it because, hey, it's Calvin Klein, right? So it makes a big difference. And then you actually start to look at what it costs to make t-shirts, and 20%, I think, of PVH's production, quite a bit of it, is actually in China, and it's listed on their website. They have this whole thing that's like transparency, so you can see where they're making things. And, it's not 100% unified how much it costs, but, between, let's say, $2.50 and about $5 is how much it makes to cost a t-shirt. And so here's PVH that's charging you $37 just to have a t-shirt that says Calvin Klein. But that's also how, if you go to the same store, like, say, Target or whatever, they can have a store brand that's $10 less than Calvin Klein, right? So you can see that the issue of branding becomes absolutely crucial. And another way to maybe even think about this is what happened during COVID, right? Like when we saw all of the prices increase rapidly, and you could see that when research was done on this, that in the height of inflation, just over 50 cents of every dollar of inflation was going towards profits. And so similar to that, like where companies know, most people have no idea how a Peloton is made. So we can essentially just make up the price of a Peloton once we reach our cost. It's the same thing with our clothing. And this is why it's the opposite of what Trump says. He says other countries are ripping off America. In fact, what's happening with the system of globalized production is a tiny number of US brands are actually ripping off the entire world in terms of saying, because it is this product, Apple, Calvin Klein, Prada, Gucci, whatever it may be, you have to pay X, Y, and Z. But they know very well, since there's a lot of opaqueness in these supply chains, that you're never really going to know exactly what it costs 9 times out of 10, and until we have these TikTok videos, of course. And so ultimately they can say, what will the market bear, right? Like, how much can we force people to pay?
Well, so much of these brands' marketing is based on selling you an idea, right? A lot of their production practices are like really enshrouded in mystery, behind this language of artisan craftsmanship, of being produced in Europe versus being made in China. Hermes, which you were talking about, the bags, they do that, Louis Vuitton, Chanel. But meanwhile, a lot of these brands have completely moved or at least partially moved their manufacturing to China. So can you talk a little bit about China's place in the value chain and, why so many of these brands are moving their manufacturing to China in the first place?
I think it's a great question. And I think the thing that people have to think about is China is always associated with like quote unquote sweatshop labor. And the reality is in the West, there's sweatshop labor. I mean, this is a little bit of an aside, but there's been investigations into some of these luxury companies that are trying to say, we're making XYZ bag. It happened to Christian Dior. It happened to Armani. And they're saying, we're making it in Europe so that, they can mark up the price because they say it's the European craftsmanship, not the cheap stuff from China. But it actually turns out that a lot of these companies are using undocumented sweatshop labor, violating every single labor law in order to be able to make things even cheaper than they make them in China, right? So in the context of all of this sort of this rhetoric, I think it's also important to understand how this sort of the label sweatshop and the label cheap labor has been applied to China and Asia more largely. But the reality is, this is highly skilled labor. Even making Nikes and t-shirts and all these different things, like these are not easy tasks or easy jobs. When they were in America, it was the same thing. People are paid very lowly. They work very hard, but they're actually doing skilled labor that is not that easy to do or to shift or to move, which is partially why China has the place it has in the manufacturing realm of America, making huge numbers of things, from textiles to parts for Boeing to parts of the iPhone and computers and all these things, is that China has really focused in on making many things, but a lot of intermediate goods. And intermediate goods are basically things that go inside other things, smaller parts that often require high precision. But because China has put a lot of money into building up its industrial base, into supporting manufacturers, industrial suppliers, in terms of building infrastructure, which is like a very underrated aspect of why manufacturing succeeds, is that it's easy to get things from the factory to the port and ship them somewhere. And China, I think, as many people have seen, if you spend any time online looking at videos, has now become, I would say, the global leader in infrastructure and infrastructure development. And of course, also a country that invests in its people and has a better social safety net. The workers tend to be more healthy, all these different sorts of things that are small things, not small things, are big things in terms of what a manufacturer thinks about, but not the things we really associate with the idea and the issue of manufacturing. But like every other country in the global south, there is an overall lower wage scale. So China combines sort of multiple different things. Lower wages than you would get in the West, although higher than most other developing countries, which is why Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India have started to take some business away from China and some of these brands, because when people are looking for low cost, the lowest cost in terms of labor is not China anymore. But you have millions of workers who are well-trained, who are skilled. And again, these are not skills you can just create overnight. You can't just say, we're going to bring a factory back tomorrow, right? So you have millions of workers who have been trained, who have worked, who have skills. You have, a good sort of government infrastructure backing so you can move things around very easily. You have support for corporations. You have the ability for them to invest in technology and other elements like that. So China really has been able to make itself the workshop of the world. Again, they make many things from small to large, but when you really start to look at globalized production, you see the reason why China is irreplaceable is they really are, second to none in finding ways to create very complex, smaller things that go into larger things that we buy. And that labor is very skilled, oftentimes requires a lot of very specialized technology, is not that easy to replace, to change, or to move. And they really have a government policy for 30 or 40 years now to emphasize building out this manufacturing base. So I think it's the opposite of what we think. Like, Boeing planes, most people don't think of as something that is like a tennis shoe or something like that. But every single Boeing plane has at least one part, and many of them multiple parts from China. So one of the most complex things that we have on the earth, an airplane that can fly all around the world, is heavily dependent on Chinese production. Just like in a lot of textiles, it's the same way. Just like in a lot of computers, it's the same way. Just like in a lot of biotechnology, it's the same way. So when we're looking sector to sector to sector, China has done more than any other country around the world to incentivize, to grow, and to build the infrastructure around its manufacturing sector, and to also bring in tens of millions of workers who have been well-trained and then can be easily employed. If you get laid off from one factory, you can go to another factory. So if you want to set up a factory in China, you're going to have also a labor force that you can really use to its maximum degree. You don't have to spend as much money on training, all these different sorts of pieces. Like you can see the iPhone has tried to move more of its production to India. That's been one of their challenges. And it's why they've been more successful at moving it to Vietnam, because Vietnam is socialist and they have similar policies to China.
Yeah, I mean, we keep trying to debunk this idea that manufacturing could ever be reshored back to the U.S. And I don't think we can emphasize enough how ridiculous that notion is. It would take years of government investment to develop the infrastructure, like train the workers, whereas China has 1.4 billion people. They have, I don't even know, like 150, 200 cities that have a population of 500,000 people or more. A lot of them are trained in building these products, trained in working factories, trained in this kind of labor. And then you have cities which are devoted to creating a certain product or a certain component in a product, right? Like Xi'an specializes in technology, also EVs, I think. Guangzhou specializes in clothing, as we were talking about. And so we just don't have that kind of manpower. And to think of a world, we can't replicate that here in the US. There's no reality where we can replicate that in the US with the population that we have. New York City is the most populous city with 8 million people, and we don't make anything here. We don't produce anything here. And I'm reminded when TSMC, they moved their semiconductor factory here. They built a plant in Arizona and they didn't have the workers. And so they had to import a lot of workers from Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, it's very common. I mean, there's a lot of stories, about this over the last number of years. I can't remember what year this was, maybe like 2013 or something. The Wall Street Journal did a story about some company. It was like not a name brand company, but they were basically just trying to like bring all their production back to the United States. And they found that they were able to bring a certain percentage of it back, but that some of the like really small parts they needed to make, there was just no company in America that made them at all. Like some other things, they were like small companies and they were able to work over a number of years, help them scale it up. But it was like something, I forget what it was like some small screw or something. Mm-hmm. And there was just no way to make it. And the only way to make it would be to build a brand new factory, to train new workers, to bring in more machines, all these other things that would certainly not have been cost effective. So they just, sort of dropped the desire. And I think that the point you're making is correct. I mean, the system of globalized production is also related to the massive expansion of consumer consumption all around the world, right? And so ultimately, the ability to just bring all the manufacturing back to the United States also just elides the concept that actually manufacturing has grown globally and that the needs and what people are bringing in has grown globally. So it's not even the same industry, it's a different industry. So yes, of course, you could bring back some jobs. So the idea that you could bring back all jobs is just not really realistic. I mean, I think that, there are some people who want to create this fantasy that that's possible, but I think the challenges to it would be very, very significant. And even you think infrastructure, which I just raised, I mean, this is a country where we struggle to get the most basic infrastructure going. Mm-hmm. And, that means in a lot of places you would have to build whole new roads and railways and ports and all these things that we struggle to do already in the context of the United States. So I don't think it's that realistic, quite frankly, in a general sense. And I don't know if it's even 100% the way we should be looking at the problem. I think a lot of people the reason people are concerned about deindustrialization is because people associate it correctly with the decline in living standards for a large amount of working class Americans. And I think the real question we have to ask ourselves is how do we improve the living standards for the working class? And, not that I'm saying we should not have more manufacturing in America, but I don't think having one of any particular type of industry is what's going to restore people's livelihood and living standards. So I think we also have to reset the conversation a lot because so much of this is designed to, I think, make people angry at China. Like, oh, they stole our jobs, 5 million jobs, and they're trying to destroy our country and all these other things, even though these were conscious decisions made by U.S. capitalists. And so the enemy is not really China, but it's a great way to distract people into thinking China is the enemy. If you make it about this zero-sum game, like the only way for Americans to have good jobs is to have factories, and the factories are all in China. So if we don't bring back all the factories, no one will have a good job. And like all along that chain, there's a huge amount of logical fallacies. But when you present it that way, it does make it easy to frame things in a new Cold War context.
Okay, so I want to go back to these viral videos. For what it's worth, some of these brands that have been named in the videos, like Louis Vuitton, Hermes, Lululemon, they've all released statements in European and US press saying that this is not true. All our products are made in Europe. But to complicate matters, I want to show you this video. It's of this guy explaining how Swiss-made, so-called Swiss-made watches are actually manufactured mostly in China and then sent to Switzerland to be finished. And it gives you an idea of certain loopholes that companies take advantage of to claim that they're made in Europe, but are actually manufactured in China. So
Swiss watches are actually made in China. And the reason that replicas often look just as good as the original is that they are made in the same factory. Let me explain what the Swiss companies do to kind of squeeze you out of money. So when you think Swiss made, you're imagining this bespoke factory in Switzerland with mountains in the background, with artisans working really hard to make exquisite timepieces. That's not the case. They make almost every component of most Swiss watches in China. And these are major brands. I'm talking Omega, Tag Heuer, Tissot. All of these companies do most of their manufacturing in China and don't tell you as a consumer. So how do they get away with calling it Swiss made if most of it is manufactured in China? Well, it's a little loophole that they have in Swiss manufacturing laws, where as long as 60% of the total cost of construction happens in Switzerland, they can call it Swiss made. But think about how it works in China. It doesn't cost a lot to manufacture. Almost all of the movement's the thing that makes this thing tick, is done in China. And then they'll take one component that might be a little bit more expensive. Usually it's something like the rotor, the thing that makes it automatically wind. And they'll just slap that on, and they'll make sure that that is 60% of the cost. Now, it also has to be manufactured in Switzerland, but what does that actually mean? It just means that they have to put this little crystal on here, the lens of the watch. As long as they slap that on in Switzerland and add the rotor here in the back, and then some engineer in Switzerland originally designed it, they can call it a Swiss watch. So again, if you're paying $6,000-7,000 for a watch, you should know that it's mostly made in China, and it probably costs less than $200 to make. And frankly, I mean, not that I should tell you to go buy a replica watch, but legitimately, they are made with the same machinery, same tools as a Swiss-made watch. Anyway, hopefully this is of value to you, and it keeps you from spending $5,000 on a watch that was made for pennies on the dollar. Anyway, I'll see you guys on the next video.
So I want to point out that that video isn't actually new. It came out, way before the tariffs, and it came out before Trump was elected. But it's saying the same thing as a lot of these viral videos of these Chinese manufacturers, right? That you have a factory in China that is contracted out to produce a certain product for a certain company. Maybe sometimes they sign a confidentiality agreement, and they produce, the name brand product side by side with what are going to be sold as knockoffs. And it's an identical product, identical in quality, but one just gets shipped off to Europe, slapped with a logo, slapped with a made in Italy or France or Switzerland tag, and then sold for thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very common. I mean, the thing is almost all things that are consumer goods nowadays, like when we say globalized production, like we really mean that. I mean, many, many things are made in multiple countries. And it's like that, I think, is this video a great example of this. And this is also an example of what I was talking about earlier with intermediate goods, right? And this is being a strength of China, like the little small technical parts, like inside a watch. If you ever looked inside a watch, a lot of very small, hard to craft, very particular kind of things to make a watch work that aren't that easy to make. But ultimately, this is an area that China has been able to carve out a good niche. And so it makes sense that you have a lot of products, like from watches, again, to jets, to cars, to different things where they have been able to master making a lot of these little parts. And so that's just the nature of how things work now. But many of these countries, to protect their historical branding, Swiss watches, French and Italian luxury goods, have manipulated their laws to try to hide this, right? So like in Italy, for instance, and also in France, the thing that to have a made in France, made in Italy is the final transformation has to be done in that country. And what exactly that means is in and of itself a little opaque, but essentially what it means is that when you like put it all together, you got to like put it all together in one place to have that label. But of course, there are many things that don't have that label, but are still presented in that way, because this is so much of the sort of way this is playing out and how these brands are manipulating us in so many different ways on so many different fronts. But to speak specifically to this, I think it's a very important thing for people to understand that this is like very common, that things are made and put together in different places. And there's a lot of different types of manipulation that goes on. Like Prada is a good example of this, right? Like Prada sells a lot of different things. The vast majority of the things that they make are made in China, India, and Vietnam, like for sure. There's no doubt about that at all. But they make certain high ticket items like 100% in Italy. So that item, which is going to be the thing that carries the brand the furthest, right? Because it's going to be the thing on the catwalks and the thing that the stars are going to be watching or whatever, they can say made in Italy. So then even though everything else isn't really made in Italy, they can still have that kind of made in Italy branding. And then they can actually mark up the price on you even more. Armani actually does the same thing, right? And so, many of these companies are manipulating the reality. As I pointed out, many of them are also running sweatshops inside of European countries in order to be able to sell things super cheaply. Like Christian Dior, I mentioned earlier, I think there was a bag they were selling for like over $2,000, making it for $57. So that, tells you something right there. But I think it also speaks to another thing about the pushback we're seeing from a lot of these companies who are like, well, we're not working with that person. We're not working with this person. But correct me if you've seen this, but I have not seen any of these companies, though, saying that they aren't ripping you off. And they can't say that because, you look at Hermes, which a lot of people are talking about because the Birkin bag, which is obviously like maybe the example of these like exorbitantly priced things. Well, a Wall Street Journal report from a couple of years ago looked into this issue and they said they were making them for about $1,000. But of course, they're selling them for like $32,000. So wherever they're making them, they're obviously still ripping you off. So that's how you also know that there's probably way more to this story, right? And that like this sort of the denials and the denunciations are sort of thou doth protest too much type situation that I'm sure the more we look into this, the more we would find. But the other thing when you look into this is that it's often not that easy to figure out exactly what's going on. And this is actually something that's been interesting to me as I've researched this, is it's always a big topic in sort of the fashion industry, fashion blog, fashion consumers, because people are always very wondering, is this the real thing or is this a knockoff? And so there's a lot of attempts that people have made to look into like what's being made where and how, and it's not that easy to find. And I think that in and of itself is also another aspect that is interesting about how these brands are pushing back, is they're making these sort of, well, we're not making this in China, or we're not working with this person who made this video, but like, are you working with someone who isn't in the video, who has their factory right next door to this person? Maybe you're not making it in China. Are you making it in India? Are you making half of it in China and making half of it in Italy? Like all these different things are still unanswered questions. And I think basically what people should bring to the table is this. Your common sense that the reason why a lot of production is not in America is deeply based on cost is correct. And so if the cost is huge, there is a big markup, which means that ultimately, no matter what their pushback is, there is no real pushback to the idea that we're being ripped off by these brands, whatever the exact geography and however it plays out. They're absolutely playing a game of global labor arbitrage to get the lowest possible cost, to set the highest possible price, to make the largest profits on your expense.
Well, I think you touched upon this earlier, but they're relying on the fact that people are still operating very much on this idea, this outdated racist idea that made in China strictly means low cost, cheap labor, sweatshops. But Chinese factories have undergone a major transformation just like within the last few years. Like almost everything is automated. They incorporate robots into production. I was watching a video on Chinese news a couple days ago, and almost everything was automated in this factory, in this garment factory. Very little was actually done by hand. And this garment factory could produce 82 t-shirts in just 1 minute. And so people have a very outdated idea of China in their minds. And it's like reflected in what JD Vance was saying like a couple of weeks ago, right? We are borrowing money from Chinese peasants to buy things that Chinese peasants manufacture. And I think that's why when people see someone like I show speed streaming from China, or they see these viral TikToks from Chongqing, their minds are blown. They're really taken aback because they really think of China as, this underdeveloped, backwards place. But they're not in tune to the reality that China is much more modern, and their infrastructure is like, it surpassed the United States at this point.
Yeah, I believe China is the #1 producer of industrial robots. So I think the vast majority of robots in factories anywhere on Earth are made in China. Someone in the comments can fact check me, but I feel pretty confident I'm right about that. And that's obviously the most advanced machinery on Earth. And of course, elements of that are, software, different things like that, I'm sure coming from different places. But the very fact that they're, at least a leading position in terms of producing robots for every factory all around the world is important. China is the largest producer of cranes in terms of ports. Like you go to a port, you see the big crane. Almost every American port, all the big cranes are actually made in China, which has become a level of commentary from Donald Trump and others. I think another area that no one really thinks about is agricultural technology, right? In China, China and the US are kind of like right at the top of agricultural technology. And, I think most people, when they think about like, sowing the soil, think about, Johnny Appleseed, just like throwing around seeds. But now actually drones are becoming a big factor in seeding the ground. And China has become a leader, by the way, leader in drones too. That's actually why when they tried to put more sanctions on drones under Biden, they had to pull back because they found out if DJI was sanctioned, there basically would be no drones. But anyway, if you look at China, especially in Xinjiang and places like that, where a lot of this is happening, becoming one of the leaders in using agricultural robots to both seed the ground, but also how to harvest fruits, it's hard to harvest fruits not by hand because, as you know, oranges, things like that, peaches, they can easily bruise, they can easily get messed up. And so this has been a big challenge everywhere trying to figure out how to make that kind of harvesting less human intensive, and China's a leader there too. So we see like all up and down the line. I mean, here's another good example right now, and one that I think is very relevant to the tariffs: airplane engines. So the US is the #1 producer of gas turbines on Earth. And gas turbines are essentially what a jet engine is, but it also plays a big role in power. And it's one of the few areas of technology where the US, to a lesser extent, Europe, Rolls-Royce is the other big one, but really the US kind of dominates over and above everyone else. And it's partially why it's been very difficult for other countries to break into making big jumbo jets, because they can't really master the engines fully. And then, of course, there are a lot of things that are done behind the scenes by the US and Europe to make it harder. But anyway, point being, China is developing its own jumbo jet. The C919, I believe, is the piece. And so originally it was going to have Rolls-Royce engines, but because of the impact of sanctions, they've had to sort of shift gears on that. And they're now trying to have an all Chinese produced engine. And they're working on that. And that's a big aspect of how and when the plane can be rolled out. But the point is, they've got some engines that seem to be working. They've done some test flights that seem to be going on. So it's actually a sign that China could be on the cusp of breaking one of the last true monopolies in terms of the imperialist control of technology. And the same thing with semiconductors, right? Like that's why they're so scared about China's impact of semiconductors, and why a lot of people against the sanctions and tariffs have said this is bad because it's going to force them to do more research and to actually break through, because there are a few of these areas of technology that the global north has really kept a stranglehold on, and they're trying to prevent that from happening. And I think it goes maybe to the final point I want to make on this, and the JD Vance thing, which is wild, which, by the way, if we were talking about like Irish peasants or whatever, he'd be like, they're the greatest people, and the stock of the Irish people is what we built on in America, blah, blah, blah. The whole thing he said about how my ancestors built this country with their bare hands. Well, they were peasants, basically, people living in Appalachian, Ohio, who were farming and mining. So like, let's keep it real, JD. But we know that there's nobody who can lie like JD Vance. I mean, Trump's vice president, who a year before he ran said Trump was America's Hitler. So he has no problem lying. But the reason why wages are lower in the global South, China and everywhere, is because the entire global South was sunk into total poverty and deprivation by the United States and the European nations. And like, that's something that people also have to recognize, is the ability of the imperialists, because the globalized production system was set up really by the United States, not even really by Europe. It was set up by the United States. Europe was assigned a role. The global South was assigned a role. The global South, which was, of course, emerging from colonialism. So everyone is paid, poverty, starvation wages, probably doesn't even describe how bad it was in many of these places. And China, of course, was one of the most destroyed countries by imperialism. You had both opium wars, you had the open door policy. And so, in an article I wrote once about this, I was reading a book. It's called The Man on Mao's Right. And it's a guy who is an English translator from Mao. And he lived in the US briefly during the 1940s. And he came from like a well-to-do family. And there's the most amazing passage in the book when he said, I came to America and I grew massively because I was eating constantly.
Yeah.
And it's just shocking that someone from like basically a rich family was essentially living in famine conditions. So it gives you a sense of the unequalness of the world, and both, certainly then and now. So in a way, the low wages in the global South are actually a big step up oftentimes from the standard of living people had before. Now, of course, a lot of that is not ideal. And that's why you've seen China, the wages have gone up significantly, because people there in China have been saying we need wages to go up. The government has responded to them. Wages have gone up. In other countries, they have not done that. But even in Bangladesh, which is an example of very low wages, you can see that the action of workers unionizing and fighting back actually has increased wages. Now, of course, it's not great and much more needs to happen, but you can certainly see that the what we see when we look at this is like not fully understanding the role of imperialism and how this is actually happening. And I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, is that, again, this is not some like plot by China or any other country to steal jobs from America. These are countries that were living in totally abject poverty, that the US was going so far out of their way to prevent them from gaining technology, from improving their economy, stopping them from trade. Like, there was a total trade blockade on China from the United States up until 1972. And for most of Europe, more or less the same time. There was a little bit of trade, but like a total trade blockade. So they were doing everything possible to keep the country down. And then at another point, for different reasons, the United States decided, you know what, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we've kept these people down for 300 years, and we're going to offer them the opportunity to improve the lives of some of their citizens in a relative sense, yes, compared to the United States, but in a relative sense to where they were, relatively significantly give them more opportunities. You also have to recognize moving people from the countryside to the urban areas and the factories has been a key factor in China and in other countries in liberating women from the extreme patriarchy of these agricultural systems, allowing them to make money, allowing them to have their own lives. The impact of the early laws of the Chinese Revolution around divorce and other things were also heavily linked with the ability of women to find employment in the cities. So, there's all these other factors that, it's not that we can't find bad things or that the standard of living should improve in the entire global South. That's unequivocal. Yes, that must happen. But part of the reason it hasn't is because of imperialism, both on the first instance when they wouldn't let them develop, and now in the second instance by trying to limit their ability to grow. And that's why the US hates China, and that's why they're targeting them, because China is the one country that has been able to significantly jump the line and to move totally out of the role that was assigned to it by the United States. And not only to become the manufacturing hub of America, but to challenge US brands at the level of global supremacy. And I think that is something that we don't fully see. But when you travel the global South, most of the brands are from the United States and Europe, no matter where it is. And so for these people, the idea that China could potentially, now have cars and phones and computers and 5G routers and drones and airplanes and all these things, very scary, because it's not even just the pure, they control the manufacturing in general of things we're branding, but that they can actually now use this system they've set up to set up competing brands. So on both levels, the global north rather, is being relatively declining, and they see China as increasing and bringing other countries along with it. And it's now impacting their policies to where they're even willing to hurt their own economy, like in the tariffs, in order to prevent this from continuing.
Well, one luxury brand that people know that is made in China is iPhones and Apple and iPhones, right? And perhaps that it speaks to China's efficient manufacturing process. But this is an example of a luxury brand that's almost completely made in China, but then all of the profits go to US capitalists. So can you speak a little bit more about this and what it says about what US capitalists are getting out of the system of globalized production? And, does it have to be this way? Is there an alternative that you see?
I think that's a great question. And it's really amazing because, last year, Honhai, Foxconn, actually had the most profits they've ever had. And they are the main supplier for Apple. There's a place in China called iPhone City where allegedly, it's never, I've been thinking 100% proven, but no one's ever challenged this. 80% of the manufacturing of iPhones is happening in this iPhone City, right? So basically the vast majority of everything happening to build an iPhone is happening here. There's some things coming from Vietnam, some things come from India, but it's all basically happening here in iPhone City in China. So Foxconn, best ever year for profits, it was just over $4 billion. Apple in 2024 had $93 billion in profits. So, and these are net profits, you know what I'm saying? I think the 93 billion was actually gross profit for Apple, I think it was maybe 60 billion. I don't know. But the magnitude of it is insane. It's Apple, who basically just has a piece of paper that says this is our product, is making tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars and has a market cap of over $1 trillion. I think it actually has the highest market cap, I think, of any company in the world. It's considered to be, the top company, but almost all of the work going into building the phone is happening in China, and they're getting a fraction, 2, 3, 4% of the profits that are being made. So the US capitalists, and I said this at the beginning of the show, but since Trump keeps saying the world is being ripped off, or the US is being ripped off by the rest of the world, couldn't be more fake. It's the US capitalists are literally ripping off the entire globe. Whether it's the people in China who aren't getting anything close to the value of the labor and other things that are coming into these products, to the people of the United States who are, basically, the last 2 iPhones ago, I remember I was kind of, looking at the sticker shock, having sticker shock when I looked at it, and the guy goes, "Oh, don't worry about it, man. It's like cars. We just lease them now." So it's we're also being ripped off as consumers. It's Tim Cook, the shareholders, and other people are getting all the money.
No. I had to buy a new MacBook just the other day because mine crashed. And it's, it's very expensive. It's $1,000. But then they're oh no, you can get on a payment plan. You can get on an installment plan. And I'm okay, More debt, great.
Yeah, perfect. And then it's like, but hey, your credit score is going to improve. But the only way to have a good credit score is to have a bunch of credit, right? It's like we're wrapped in these crazy webs of debt. So we're all being so ripped off. And I think that speaks to the second half of your question of like, does it have to be this way? And my answer is no, not at all. Like in a way, the thing about globalized production is, it makes sense, right? Because like first and foremost, production has been globalized for a long time. Like capitalism as a system is kind of based on global production. It's expanded over time, but like the whole basis of the United States existing, right, is the ability to make things in one place and ship them somewhere else and make a lot of money, right? The whole triangular trade. And one of those things, sadly, was the important trade in people via the slave trade. But like this has always been the case. And it's just been moving forward, more and more because our technology is improving. And so the more we can communicate more quickly with people, the easier it is to travel to more people. I mean, people have been trading since the beginning of time in humanity, right? It's one of the most human things possible that some people have certain skills, other people have different skills, and you try to find a way to work together with the people who you can find in different places to get the things that you need and the things that you want and to be able to exchange them in ways that make that sustainable for everyone. So this is actually one of the most natural human activities, but it's been perverted by capitalism because yes, production is globalized. Yes, it's natural in some ways that these things are happening, but the benefits of it are accruing just to a tiny number of people by and large. But overall, it doesn't mean that this system can't be made to work for workers. Because if you think about what I was saying earlier about how China, has been able to sort of plan these changes, like that's why China got ahead of what America ever expected, because American capitalists, and I think a lot of this is racism, had no respect for China's centralized planned economy and didn't think that they could also think 20 years in the future and be like, this is where we are now, this is where we would like to be. And unlike America, where you're like, this is where we are now, this is where we'd like to be, and then nothing happens, they were just like, let's just put together a series of plans. What do we have? What do we need? How do we educate people? What do we need to build? What technology do we need? All these different things. And the entire structure of the country was directed to accomplish these goals. So if we know we have a lot of goals in America, why don't we just do the same thing? And when you think about the challenges that face the world, people pretty much want the same thing everywhere else, right? They want a good standard of living. I think people are very conscious of the environment now. I think they want it to be sustainable. So it's like, why don't we plan our economy and say, okay, what do we have? What do we need? And what do we want? And what does it take to get there? And then work with countries like China, countries like Vietnam, countries like Cuba, different countries, and really all the countries, hopefully, and say, let's all plan it, so that we don't have any poverty in the world, so that we don't have any hunger in the world, so that everyone can have access to food, clothing, shelter, access to information. Like if people have all those things, who cares where anything is made? Realistically, like if you are able to have a good quality life, what does it matter? And so they're trying to divide workers all around the world by creating this sort of nationalist, zero-sum race to the bottom. Like the only way things can be good for you is for them to be bad for someone else. The only way to have a good job in America is to have a factory. The only way to have all these different things and all these different assumptions. But I think that's totally false. I think if we say as a humanity, as a human species, we all have relatively similar challenges and relatively similar goals and aspirations. We have a finite amount of resources, both material and human. So why don't we collaborate to the maximum degree to have the maximum benefit from this finite amount of human resources and material resources, and then ask ourselves the same question, now that we have everything we need, what do we want? And then maximize what we want by also working together with all our human and material resources, and then say, where do we want to go? What do we really need as a society moving forward in 20 years? And how should we structure the world to do that as well? Like we need to come together as a human family to accomplish these tasks that are affecting all humans. And climate change, that's affecting everybody. Poverty affecting everybody, immigration affecting everybody. So these are already global challenges. And the only people who benefit by siloing it off country by country are the tiny group of people who are benefiting from this nationalist race to the bottom. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to talk about the need for socialism. I think China's example shows that a planned economy is the most logical way to approach how you organize a society. And I think we can take a lot from that. We could certainly innovate a lot from that. And we could find a way, like it's not just about what some Democrats have said, oh, we should have a competition with China, but it should be peaceful. Why should we have a competition? Like if they want to end poverty, we want to end poverty. So why don't we just say, how can we work together to end poverty in both places and like give people jobs and healthcare and all these different things? Like the whole idea that it needs to be a competition, I think is wrong. And we just need to take the globalized economy and turn it on its head. Instead of making it profit first, make it people first.
Well, I want to end on, all of these videos as part of this cultural phenomenon. I can't help but think that Trump's tariffs are continuing to bridge the digital divide between Chinese people and American people, right? And this was something that was set in motion when, a lot of these TikTok users migrated to Xiaohongshu and they started seeing what life was really like in China. And, decades of billions of dollars of U.S. propaganda against China began to, kind of melt away. And it was continued, a couple weeks ago when iShow Speed went to China and he was live streaming, all of these different places, and Americans were able to see what China was like for the first time, And now that China has ended, they don't require a visa for Americans anymore. Like you can go to China for up to 10 days without applying for a visa. And so a lot of these Chinese manufacturers are encouraging people to go to China, stock up on these like name brand luxury items, and visit China. And that would still be cheaper. The cost of the round trip and buying all these products would still be a lot cheaper than, buying the name brands themselves. So what does this all say about, this kind of content and how it's hitting with people? Because I feel like this is a major shift. People wouldn't have felt this way maybe like a couple years ago.
No, I think that's right. And I think it's, it's partially because it's taken things out of the realm of rhetoric and brought them into the realm of reality, right? And when people realize what they lose in the context of the new Cold War and then potentially a hot war, it changes their whole perception, right? And like people liked TikTok. And I think people probably had like some idea that TikTok was a Chinese company or whatever, but they're mainly just using one of many social media aspects. But then the opportunity to lose it was like, wait a second, this is like, they're not working for us. Like this is hurting me. This is hurting my small business I've created at home and generating my income. So maybe there is something else I don't know about China. Like now that I'm seeing how the anti-China policies are hurting me, there's something else. And then when your mind becomes open and you think like, okay, well, what's really going on there? And then this is why people have said for years, and I think it's correct, why people-to-people diplomacy is a huge factor in reducing tensions between nations. Because when average everyday people across the divide of borders interact, they often find that they have way more in common than they thought. And so much of the propaganda is like, these people are evil, they're this, they're that. And then you're just like, oh, wait a second, we have similar interests and there's similar things and we're all workers. And like in the same way I get up and go to work every day, they're getting up and go to work every day. We have some of the same frustrations. We like a lot of the same things, in different pieces. And of course, many people in China, of course, know a lot about the United States as well, right? And so they're eager to see what's really happening in the US. Like, is what I saw what's really happening? And so there's this desire to, I think, dialogue, but it takes a lot to break through that. And I think this is part of the TikTok piece that, ultimately broke through because people were hurt. I think that's why these issues with these bags have also hit them, because it's like, you're being ripped off to some degree, but when you find out that it's like, potentially this big, it's like, whoa, wait a second, like what's going on here? And then again, it makes you think, what is really happening? I need to start to look more. I need to start to look at different things. And that's why iShow Speed, I don't know exactly why I decided to go to China, but I think it speaks to why a lot of people are going. I read something of some high school student from like Iowa or something who went on like a school trip and has now been back like 7 times. And he was like, yeah, I went and it was a great place and I loved it here. And so I just kept in touch with some of the people I met and now I go back every year, you know what I'm saying? And now he's in college or whatever. But obviously just having the average everyday interactions, a bridge was built between people. And so I think that there's an innate curiosity that opens up when you recognize that what you've been told is not true. And I think that's why this is so important, this cultural moment that's happening between Chinese people and American people that is kind of really unmediated by anyone other than themselves. People are having these direct interactions. And I think it's important. And I think it's something that more needs to happen and that there are a lot of spaces. And this has actually been one of the things that's been closed down the most by the new Cold War, right? Like prior to the aggressive turn, there was a lot of people-to-people interaction between China and the United States. In fact, remember, that's what Tim Walz got hit for being involved in people-to-people interactions. But this was part of why you did have support, when China came into the WTO and the most favored nation. And obviously there were contradictions to how that happened. But I think people's view of China had changed a lot over the past 30 or 40 years, because not just the change in relations between the countries, which was important, but also people had more actual interaction and impact and different things like that. And I think there's a lot we can build on. I think there's a lot more that's there. And I think it goes both ways, right? Like I think there's a lot of interest. Basketball is huge in China. The NBA is huge there. I think that's an untapped bridge as well. Sports and sporting events and things of that nature, where there are a lot of similar cultures, gaming, all these different things where there's a lot of, I think, sort of a global culture around these things where Chinese and US people can really interact in a way that is humanizing rather than dehumanizing. But this is the challenge, is that every piece of propaganda is like, this is the most evil place on earth. I mean, I don't know. You'd think you're going to like see someone get executed in the street or something if you go to China. You know what I mean? Like, 'cause it's just like, there's no democracy, there's no this, there's no that. And it's hard to break through that. So I think we have to make the most of these moments, and people should go and see for themselves. If they have that ability, and if they don't have that ability as individuals, they should try to get together with a group and see if they can create that kind of opportunity. And love it, hate it, in between, at least you will have seen for yourself, as opposed to just listening to like the select committee on the CCP that appears to know nothing when you actually like listen to them and read what they're talking about.
Well, Eugene Pereier, that's all the time we have. Thank you for joining us on the China Report. Do you want to let viewers know where people can find you on Breakthrough News?
Absolutely. You can find me every Thursday live 3 to 5 on the Freedom Side. You just got to go to youtube.com/breakthrough news. So you basically can find me wherever you find the China Report.
Well, this clip is from the recent Zhongyu Temple Fair in Dongfeng, China. At the fair, there are nearly 100 kinds of food stalls, including one that sells what's called Kung Fu Flying Pancake. Once you watch the video, you can see easily why this vendor is the most popular stall at the market. Just a reminder, if you liked this episode, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.